Before we get started, let's just set the scene a little bit around what we're talking about. And I think, as we round out 2025 and barrel towards 2026, the discussions that we're having with our customers and partners and analysts are really a lot around hybrid cloud strategy. It continues to be a topic of discussion for most organizations. It's been a very disruptive couple of years for those who are leading up their company's strategy across public, private, and other clouds. And this has only been pressurized more and more by the AI race from cloud vendors, where new services are being introduced almost every week. Rising public cloud players such as Oracle and Alibaba and more joining the pack with those bigger vendors like Google, Amazon, and Microsoft, who really owned and were dominant for a long time most of the market. The continued fallout that organizations are feeling from Broadcom's acquisition of VMware. Many organizations are still trying to plan for that renewal cycle that they're at some stage in right now. The expansion of things like AI-focused clouds, so neo clouds, that many companies are having to resort to bring some of their AI workloads to. And then just the continued pain that organizations are feeling from cost, governance, security, and more. And those were problems that were already there and already existed, and they've only been exacerbated by some of the other things that I talked about. And so we thought this was a great time to have this type of discussion, and we've got a great lineup of people to help us have that conversation today. So I'll quickly introduce myself. My name is Will Norton. I am a vice president of product marketing here at CloudBolt. Prior to CloudBolt, I ran at Cognizant Technology, I ran the migration practice. So any data center exit to the public cloud and rationalization effort was done by my teams. Very interesting to be on the other side of that, where now we're rationalizing backwards in a lot of cases. I also led a cloud FinOps team as well as CCOE consulting. We're also joined by Will Kelly, who's a freelance journalist who has authored hundreds and hundreds of cloud, AI, DevOps, and enterprise mobility public pieces for top tech publications. We have worked with Will Kelly a ton because many people at our company, every time he gets something out there, we quickly rush to go read it. He's a challenger in the market and is definitely a great speaker for today's topic around repatriation and cloud management in general. We also have Mike Bombard, who has spent his career specializing in designing automation orchestration solutions, both for on-prem and hyper-virtualized environments, all the way through to the public cloud. He's been with our team for about 4 or 5 years now. Prior to that, worked directly with federal agencies and more in the DC area. No stranger to all things private and public cloud. Then finally, Whit Walters, who's a field CTO at GigaOM. GigaOM is a global industry research firm that authors reports ranging from cloud FinOps to DevOps, and more recently, the cloud management platform research that CloudBolt was featured in. So we got a great lineup of guests today. And I'll go ahead and kick off and set the scene. So repatriation, a very hot topic, plenty of thoughts from this panel here. And why we wanted to lead with that is internally, we were having this discussion. Why is this trending again? If you look at Google, just search volume, you see that from 2020 to now, the cloud repatriation terms and phrases have spiked. And after 20 years of cloud, why is this coming back to the forefront? I think to set the scene, we have to go back a little bit and talk about the rise of public cloud and really the promise of public cloud to understand how we got from being mostly on-prem to now a lot of companies rationalizing whether they want to continue to expand. So in 2006, AWS had this novel idea that would allow developers to provision infrastructure in 3 minutes. Flash forward to 2025, Amazon is a $1 trillion company. The AWS segment alone is over $100 billion in annual revenue. And if you look at the earnings from the time that they were publicly available all the way to the last year's results, it has just continued to climb. Most of us on this call probably know why, but it's worth double clicking into what AWS made available that wasn't available before. And really, it starts with this notion of abstraction removed friction. there's been three kind of core questions that cloud leaders in their organizations have been asking for as long as they've been operating the cloud. One, can you truly abstract the complexity of your cloud infrastructure? It's been a race to abstract away the complexity since we were on-prem and even in bare metal situations. Can you make it easily consumable and automated for your users? So remove the technical barrier, make it easier to get and procure. And then the final thing is, can you do all of this without increasing risk to the company? And so Amazon, whether they were trying to do this or not, when they set out with AWS, we got some answers. The first is, and I think this is unequivocally true if you ask anybody, AWS really did, like public cloud really did abstract the complexity of cloud infrastructure. It moved the user far away from the wires and server racks that you would need to understand for procurement prior. Can you make it easily consumable and automated? I'd say mostly. In most cases, yes, public clouds do that exactly. There might be some cases where you could argue no, but in most cases, it is very easily consumable and automated. And then the final is, can you do all of this without increasing risk to the company? And this is one where most organizations would say, no, that has not been the case. When you double click on risk, we're talking about cost risk, talking about governance risk, talking about security risk. We're talking about making all of this abstracted complexity, this easily consumable tech, and this agility that comes with it. How do we service that in a controlled way? So not only did the public cloud remove friction, but it also removed control. And after many, many, many years of organizations grappling with that lack of control, it's where you start to get conversations around repatriation, where we look at the past as the good old days of we need to get back to where we had more control. And so what we would submit, and some of the discussion we're going to have today, is you really have to separate the signals from the noise. There's a lot of noise out there. There's a lot of fear. There's a lot of cost panic. There's a lot of repatriation headlines. There's a ton of noise that floods these strategic decisions. And really look at the signals. What most organizations are looking for is control, agility, clarity across their clouds, and sustainable architecture that can be managed at scale, but also can be controlled at scale without a ton of risk. And so I'm going to invite Will Kelly, who's somebody who's swimming in these types of topics and is working with organizations all across the world in these discussions, to zoom in on this a little bit more. So Will, I'll hand it over to you.
Thank you, Will Norton. First, a little bit about me. I got my start documenting data centers and infrastructure. Later on, I moved into more of the publications and marketing side of things. I wrote a lot about cloud migration and cloud management in the public sector. And then I moved into writing about cloud and FinOps for publications. The intersection of the technology business, leadership, and cost has always been fascinating to me, since it's a perpetual pain point. And it's a perpetual pain point you're not going to get away from, whether you remain in the cloud or you go back on premise. And that's something that is maybe not shaking out in some of the cloud repatriation discussions I've been privy to. I used to see cloud repatriation as a FinOps problem. But really what it comes down to, it's emblematic of deeper issues about data management and corporate culture. And the pressure starts at the top. It's a board member who may read an article who sees, wow, there's all this money we could be saving. Everybody's talking about it. My buddies were talking about it. Why aren't we repatriating apps? And that puts the CEO and the CFO on alert. They get an order from up above saying, get cloud repatriation done. We need savings this quarter. We need to make our numbers. We need to make our next round of funding. So a lot of that financial pressure is only magnified by the current economic times that we're all in right now. Then it's the head of cloud engineering at the bottom. You know, as the old saying goes, everything always rolls downhill. This person's more of a realist, thinks to himself, we can't migrate our way to maturity. And he looks around his staff. While his staff is very capable in the cloud, they know cloud management, they've done a good job at porting applications to the cloud. The data center experience and the infrastructure experience on-prem is kind of lacking. I became to see all these discussions as, after writing about how everybody was becoming cloud first, I later watched everybody become cloud fatigued. Now everybody's just cloud fed up. I don't see repatriation as a trend or even transformation. It's an attempt at reconciliation. It's not that this reconciliation is out of every company's hands, but a lot of people are not looking at the complete picture of the challenges. Now, it's easy when you're not working in IT to see everybody in IT as a hero. They're pulling the late hours. They're responding to breaches. But my argument is the hero that everyone assumes still exists largely does not exist anymore. If you take a look at the drawing on the left-hand side of the slide, this is an artist's rendering of what a data center specialist who had pulled off cloud migrations and data center migrations might look like today. That's right. It's an old guy. Retirements and ageism have stripped enterprises of their muscle memory for operating their own infrastructure on premise. We have a whole generation of IT workers who's never had the delight of 2 a.m. pages late on a Friday night to respond to an outage at their local data center or colo, or that they've had to rack and stack their hardware. Or have they ever had to respond to every element of a breach because they always had the CSP or hyperscalers security operations center and staff there to work with? The unfortunate truth here is the people who built the data centers are largely gone in many enterprises. The ones who are left are Googling how it worked. The talent has been aged out, and that's a reality. There's a lot of struggles that enterprise buyers still have in 2025. Like I said previously, I saw this as much more of a FinOps problem. Conversations I had with the good folks at CloudBolt and some other industry conversations showed it to be a lot more. There's the operational burdens. People have expanded too much into the cloud. There's an over complexity. People building something elaborate just because they could, or that their cloud architecture tools and systems and frameworks were immature. And then there's also the problems of technical debt. And that's not going to escape any enterprise if they want to go on premise. I also try, in the conversations I've had in the past, to look at the triggers. I split these triggers into reality and legitimate, and the ones that may be uninformed. Of course, there's going to be that budgeting whiplash. You've overspent on cloud 6 months in a row. There's trouble. The board is breathing down your CFO's neck. Your CFO is breathing down your cloud team's neck. There's also always going to be the cultural power shifts. The people who are running your systems on the cloud may not have the same power and influence when systems move back to the data center. Moving back to the data center, it's I don't want to make it sound like a mission impossible. There are valid triggers. There's regulatory compliance if you're dealing with GDPR. If you're dealing with some of the other emerging laws and regulations around data and artificial intelligence, it's something you have to look at. But the biggest trigger, the most valid trigger in my mind is predictable workloads. The first impetus for many enterprises to go into the cloud is scalable workloads. If you don't have that issue anymore, it certainly puts that workloads up as candidates to go back on premise. And everybody's always worried about latency and performance, especially with older, more legacy applications. The invalid triggers, I've been a big follower of FinOps for a while. I've seen its sort of story arc. Just because you don't have a FinOps program or your FinOps program has struggled, those cost problems are going to follow you once you transition from OpEx to CapEx. The same visibility gaps you had in the cloud, you're going to find similar ones on premise. Post outage panic, let's face it, Cloudflare, the recent AWS outage, it's only that panic is going to strike even more folks because your team now owns the entire outage. There's no CSP there to back you up. Cloud pain doesn't always come from technical debt. It comes from trust debt between teams, tools, and truth. All of those things, doesn't matter whether you're on premise or in the cloud, tools and where your application sits don't make a difference. The three fails driving repatriation, it's been something I've been studying for a while. You're still going to find similar challenges when you go back on premise. When I've been privy to these and discussions, I've always seen the common theme of immature cloud management practices and big gaps in their operations, and just this copy paste pattern and cargo cult architecture over things. Similar problems are going to follow you on premise. It's not that I'm in denial about the value of cloud repatriation. I continue to question if the average enterprise is equipped to handle it, whether it's with staffing or tools or frameworks or processes and even budget and architecture. So from years of being a writer and talking to a lot of stakeholders, I've always enjoyed getting what I would call pictures from the wild. The pictures from the wild, to me, they've started off because the road to cloud management intentions is paved with abandoned cloud tools and half-baked transformation plans. Planning expertise become even more critical now. Of course, there's going to be compliance fatigue. Endless audits are going to be tiring. They're going to follow you on premise. There's going to be that time that your compliance documentation is going to be out of date. Let's face it, nobody reads the compliance reports until the corporate counsel pings them on Slack with a request for data. Security drift. There's a lot of unmanaged risk out in the cloud, especially for enterprises who started more ad hoc. That bad habit's not going to stop when you're migrating your workloads from cloud to on-premise. Granted, I do see the comment about Basecamp and 37 signals. I follow the company myself. Not everybody is 37 signals. I'm talking about mid-sized to large firms who may not have the technical staff, engineers, and experience internally to manage this. And the idea starts from a 500-word article that a board member reads or an executive reads, and it cascades down to the cloud team. Waste, over provisioning and overspending can still happen on premise. It's just not because of cloud sprawl. It really does come down to control. Boards and CFOs want clean and defensible answers. Fear and anxiety oftentimes drive immediate answers to boards and CFOs that people sometimes don't think all the way through. So it's up to the cloud team to educate their executives. It's up for the executives to build positive relationships with the board and even try and get all three of those parties together. Because I'm willing to bet you, as I said, not everybody is 37 signals. So not everybody knows what the other person's job actually entails or what their concerns and pain points might be. Common accusation that I've heard in some past discussions I've had in the past month has been every CFO thinks they're a cloud strategist now, Will. That's not completely on the CFO. Comes down to also about poor collaboration and poor communications between teams. Repatriation can also be a battle for clarity that was lost in the cloud along with your AWS bill. That clarity is hard to achieve in some small and mid-sized organizations, especially as a lot more people working hybrid and remote. But when you dig into your cloud repatriation challenges, I recommend that you really look at your communications and collaboration. Because I was told once when I was writing an article that cloud repatriation is just governance with better PR. I agree with that to a certain point, but comes down to a lot of the problems that I've walked through here.
Thank you, Will. I appreciate that. We're going to move on to Mike too, and I think context maybe for Mike as we transition is that I know a lot of times when customers start working with us, we will hear things like, we'd love to bring a public cloud experience to our on-prem environments or our hybrid environments. But just as often, we're hearing we want to bring a governance layer across all things. And more we're hearing, well, how do we bring more governance and control to our public clouds? And so these things are very much converging. And since you're on the front end of that, I thought that would be a good transition to some of your talk track here, building off of Will. So, Mike, I'll go ahead and hand it off to you.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, Wills. So I think really what we want to start is by digging into control means more than just visibility. I think visibility is obviously a big part of that picture, but how do we really drive organizational change through controlling what we're doing inside of our cloud environments? Starting with visibility, we need to know what's running. We need to know where and why. That's not just visibility. There's two things that come to mind here. One would be cost visibility, but also, forgive me, but also operational visibility, understanding what's going on in the environments. How are these workloads performing? How do we get some good visibility so that we can understand that? Second piece would be governance, being enforcing policy before anything ships. I think about this in the idea of what are the patterns that we've established as an organization that our developers and our end users should be able to consume from the public cloud. I think for a long, long time, we've allowed users to just provision whatever they want, flavor of the day, without any controls or guidelines there. And really, governance is just pulling that back in, not slowing the developers down, but making sure that they're building the right workloads in the right way. Governance, I usually look at this through 3 or 4 different lenses. One would be security, making sure that we're securing workloads when we build them. 2 would be from a compliance standpoint, is making sure that if we have compliancy requirements, they're being built in accordance with that. I also look at like financial guardrails and workload forecasting and like cost forecasting, as well as budget adherence, maybe putting some controls in front of these workloads before we request them, so their end users are taking an informed approach to how they're provisioning workloads with the lens of cost to the organization up front. And then finally, approvals would be kind of the last thing for governance. If it's too expensive, unrecognized pattern, do we approve it? Automation is another important piece here. I usually look at automation from the lens of integration. So as we're building new resources or changing existing resources, are we able to automate the end-to-end process that our organization has determined we need to follow? That could include checking with things like our ITSM systems of record, our ServiceNow, or Remedy, whatever your ITSM system is, to ensure that changes are audited and logged so that we can go back and track any misconfigurations and have a history of what's going on inside of the environment. Event-based orchestration is another key component to automation. Can we react to certain conditions inside of the environment? If we can't, we're putting ourselves in a bad position. And then third, for automation, I usually look at lifecycle management. Think of things of like TTLs and power scheduling. If Bob goes out and builds an expensive AI workload in the cloud, but he leaves next week, who's there to tell us what this workload's for, to tear it down, even though it was just a development playground? So those kinds of things can really drive cost up and drive our control down. And then finally, portability. This is really the idea of how easily can I deploy the same pattern across my different cloud accounts, whether it's AWS, GCP, Azure. Is it something that we can also provision on-prem as well? But portability is another key component that I would typically look at in the realm of control. Most organizations have a control gap. I don't think this is something that I think most of us can agree with this. The biggest risk in 2026 isn't cloud costs, it's control fragmentation. And we look at this through 2 different lenses, the first of which being, do we lock everything down? Do we force our users to go through some rigorous process that slows their velocity down as developers and delivering the reason that they belong to our organization? And that's, I've seen this in the cloud space is kind of, sometimes organizations will build and develop a cloud center of excellence or a platform engineering team where all that they're doing is kind of remanufacturing, like Will said earlier, some of those legacy practices that, they're now taking ServiceNow tickets, they're building out the infrastructure, then they hand it back to the devs. So now we've put some manual processes back in place, slowed down our developers, all in the name of control. Can be very problematic. Shadow IT grows, frustration mounts, those things. And then on the opposite side of the spectrum, you see free-for-all procurement, where our developers are just going out, building their own cloud accounts. They're not really taking security into consideration. Everything that they do is in the name of velocity and getting our applications built as quickly as possible. You see the increased bills from AWS and Azure, misconfigurations from human error and things along those lines. then if we move into, if we look back at, the last 2 decades or so, if we look at the data center discipline and kind of poke at some of the things, sometimes we can look back at the data center days and through rose glasses, and there are some things that I certainly miss about those days, but there are other things that I think we don't talk about enough, is procurement before deploy. Do you procure your assets well in advance so they sit idle in your data center, or do you wait the 6, 9, 12 months that it takes to scope out your requirements, rack and stack, hook up the networking, configure your workloads, and then get everything up and running in your environment? Change control processes is so, for any of you that ever sat in the basement with 20 or 30 other architects that went through an exercise to sharpshoot your architectural plans, really slowed down velocity. So there are a lot of things that the data center, I think, did some of these drivers that are driving customers back to the data center. I think there are some things that we'd like to poke at a little bit. There are certain, like Will said, valid use cases in the data center, but yeah, taking a look at now this idea of cloud chaos, where sure, we procure after deploy, but our costs are out of control. There are a lot of efficiencies that I think, inefficiencies that Will poked at here that I want to continue to go down that road. But really what I want to do is look forward and look at this through a multi-cloud lens, bringing control to whether you are still in the data center business in some piece of your business, or all of your business, or all in on cloud, or somewhere in between. The idea of a multi-cloud discipline, leveraging a cloud management platform to help you gain control over those workloads so that we're doing things in an appropriate manner. A couple of things that I would argue are critical for a cloud management platform. One would be guardrails before deployment and ongoing throughout day 2 activities and things like that, but making sure that workloads are being built correctly in the first place. Number 2 would be unified visibility, the ability to view into all of our cloud accounts, all of our endpoints, see all of the resources that are provisioned so that we can generate dashboards and reports to understand really what we're doing inside of each of these environments. Policy automation is extremely important. We can't bake policy into this. We're unable to secure workloads and drive the compliance that we talked about earlier. And then finally, workload portability, leveraging patterns, well understood patterns, to be able to standardize the outcomes that we're looking to generate inside of our cloud accounts. And yeah, so I'm going to land on, when you run the cloud like you own it, there are a couple of benefits that you gain from this approach. 1, visibility becomes inherent regardless of where resources are provisioned. 2, optimization becomes proactive. You should be able to react to certain conditions in your environment, things like waste signals, to be able to take action against those resources to ensure that your cloud resources are optimized at all times. Control begins to scale. You're no longer struggling with controlling these resources. And finally, agility doesn't slow down. We're continuing to deliver on the promise of time to value that the cloud always promised, while remaining agile within our development teams. So we do have a lot of our customers on Cloud Bolt that are aspiring towards this or working towards this goal. So to unpack the cloud management picture in greater detail, I'm going to go ahead and hand things over to Whit.
Thanks, Mike. So I want to talk a little bit about the GigaOM radar and how we see the market of cloud management platforms. So when we look at the cloud management platform market right now, there's a lot of noise. And so what we've tried to do is cut through some of that noise and start to take a look and evaluate the vendors. And to do that, we create a lens to evaluate kind of the whole ecosystem. And in creating that lens, we start with table stakes. What do all the cloud management vendors do? What does everybody do to even be considered in this space? So it's a lot of the things that Mike was talking about how do I manage my visibility? How do I manage my workflows? How do I put all those pieces together? Then we take a look at the key features. Those key features are kind of where everybody's starting to play, who's better than how do we kind of look at that in terms of what are my business use cases? What do I need to be solving? Then we take a look at some of the emerging features. This is where the market is going. So it gives us then some visibility into not just where we are right now, but where are things going to be going within the next couple of years. And then finally, we look at business criteria. The business criteria, as we evaluate a radar, gives us an idea of not just the speeds and feeds and the technical things, but how well does it scale? How do I manage my workflows? Do I hit certain business criteria that I need to be able to think about as we put these things together? Then we evaluate the market and we look at the two axes you'll see here, which is maturity versus innovation. When I look at maturity, I'm not talking about time in market, like how long you've been doing this. I'm looking at the workflows and the process, my interface. How stable is it going to be over the life cycle of my investment in your product? Then I look at innovation. How quickly are you adding new features, new functionality, new things that may slightly be changing my workloads, but are going to be adding value to the product? Then I look at feature versus platform play, which is the horizontal axis. When I say feature, I'm talking about some very narrowly defined products that really do things and I can stack them together to create a broader platform. Then when I look at platform play, I'm thinking about it like from a CTO's perspective. I'm looking at a platform that can do multiple things. And again, it's more of a giga-ohm definition. So a product that calls itself a platform but doesn't do all the things that we expect it to do in this space gets defined as a platform, and things that are broad and do multiple things, really we think about that as a platform. Then we've got the three circles around the radar. That outside circle is poorly named, but we call it an entrant, even though they may have been around for a while. If you're not doing everything as well and keeping up with the pack, that's kind of where you land, because what we do is we aggregate all of those scores. So it's not just a simple leader follower method like who's best. We really take a look at, hey, here are the specific business use cases that cloud management platforms need to be able to do. Then inside of there, we've also got the challenger ring, which is kind of where the broad parts of the field lay. And then finally, we've got the leadership ring kind of in the center that says, hey, these are leaders, these are all scoring high all the way across all of our decision criteria as we build the radar out. Next slide, please. And so on this, I want to talk a little bit about where we see Cloud Bolt positioned. And so when we're looking at cloud management platforms and that desire to repatriate and running the cloud like you own it, the ability to be able to kind of manage your cloud and infrastructure, not only your cloud infrastructure, but your entire stack and your whole ecosystem of products, whether it's in the cloud, on-prem, neo-cloud, multiple locations, really kind of comes down to where we see this on the radar. So this is why this placement is now important. And we see Cloud Bolt as a leader because they've scored very highly on our criteria. And as part of that, we also then see that they're also kind of moving in a really rapid direction. And they're also an innovator. That innovation is important because Cloud Bolt is putting out new features, new products. They're adding some AI in very dynamic and interesting ways. And this really kind of puts them ahead of the pack in terms of how we evaluated them, we saw them. So things like security policies, code, and some of the AI-driven orchestration pieces, they're really kind of pushing that conversation forward, kind of building on some of the things that Mike was saying, that you're really looking at platforms to be able to do. And so we see this as a differentiator in the space. And this is how we've evaluated Cloud Bolt on our 2025 cloud management platform piece. Will?
Thanks, Whit. Notable, GigaOM is one of the few remaining research companies that is still doing research on cloud management. And so we saw a lot of other research firms moving away from that position, degrading, whatever you want to call it, deprioritizing cloud management during the years where I would say public cloud was moving very quickly. And I think there was this notion of maybe cloud management being less and less important. But I would say that ultimately GigaOM was a bit ahead of the pack insofar as biting that, hey, the public cloud is not going to go away and you're still going to need this abstraction layer of management. So very impressed with this radar report the last few years. We put a link in the chat for everybody to look at. If you haven't had your copy yet, you should be able to see that. So, all right, let's bring it all home, and then we can maybe have some questions for the panel before we roll off. So, listen, there's 5 capabilities that every platform is going to need as we kind of move forward. At the top of this conversation, I brought up a lot of the disruption points, and you heard from Whit and Will and Mike about some other ones that are very prominent. And so, our view of this is that unified visibility across hybrid and multi-cloud, that layer that sits above all clouds, is going to be increasingly important. We are seeing the bifurcation of investment continue to rise for a lot of companies. Even those companies that were all in on one public cloud vendor, in many cases, have broken down and found themselves doing some level of workload somewhere else. Continuous optimization, cost will continue to be a problem. As Will mentioned earlier on, it's not just a problem in the public cloud. For those who are looking to go back on-prem in any way, shape, or form, cost is still going to be an issue. It is going to be very hard to grapple with a CapEx versus an OpEx model. We felt that as we were moving from a CapEx to an OpEx model, and trying to go in reverse is going to be just as painful. And realistically, most of the cloud is still very much over provisioned and spending a lot more than it needs to be. Policy-driven governance, Mike talked a ton about that. It's got to be control without bottlenecks. You have to get to a place where you feel comfortable about what's happening in your clouds in a way that's not slowing down the agility that you need to be very competitive, especially when so many organizations are moving quick. And we know there's competitive advancements happening nearly every day. Cost and performance correlation, those have to be in balance. In a lot of ways, they've been imbalanced for too long. And we've seen a lot of companies put a renewed focus on that. And then orchestration that scales at the speed of cloud. There's more and more tools, there's more and more clouds, there's more and more connections, there's more and more patterns, and that is not going to slow down. But how do you do that in a very efficient way without bringing risk to your company? So we hope that was very informative. I'd love to open it up for any questions that any attendees have to throw in the chat. I know we had one about repatriation, and I appreciate what you threw. One of the more stark examples that we've seen out there in Basecamp, which I think spurred a lot of the market conversation. I will point out, but I'd love to take from the panelists, that a lot of times repatriation isn't a full stop move back to the private cloud. And a lot of times it's really halting public cloud adoption in a meaningful way. But Will, maybe I'll start with you. What other companies are you seeing are maybe aggressively thinking about repatriation, or maybe better stated, are there shades of gray with repatriation?
I'm seeing more action on repatriation on the people who are security and compliance conscious. The last story I was privy to, it was on the life sciences side. So it's people who have big security considerations, and they may not have been as well prepared for it as they should have been.
Mike, Whit, any thoughts, Whit?
Yeah, as Will said earlier, not everybody's David Hannemeyer Hansen, who invented Ruby on Rails and has done some pretty amazing things in his life. What I'm hearing about repatriation is kind of like what Will said, is certain companies are looking at, okay, how do I get my cloud costs under control? And I've been a CTO, and I've been handed a few ridiculously outrageous AWS bills and gotten blindsided by some poor configuration management or somebody leaving something on for the weekend that was supposed to have been shut off. As we're seeing more enterprises go to multi-cloud, what we're really seeing is the desire to get our cloud management kind of taken care at scale. And so we're looking at, okay, if I'm running something in AWS and I've got a workload in Vertex over in GCP, and I'm doing something else in Azure, and I've got all of my ERP stuff running over in OCI because they're demanding it up there. How do I manage all of that? How do I get control and how do I see it? I think it kind of really builds on what Will said. Then I'm looking at, okay, any new things? How do I get that under control? Do I try to bring it back to my own data center? Do I do that? And I think for large enterprises, cloud is the way to go. But they're also looking at how do I get security compliance and regulatory alliance on some of these smaller workflows that are maybe highly regulated, like in healthcare or in finance, where they're looking at how do I know that the cloud's going to be the right way? How do I do it? So I think we're hearing some noise from the industry in terms of how do I get some of these really hairy workloads back under control, and so I can manage that time and budget and really know that I'm not going to get a surprise bill that completely blows my IT budget out of the water for the year.
Mike, I'd love to throw a VMware question your way, just because I know it comes up a lot, and I'm sure there's some thoughts from the rest. But how is the Broadcom acquisition of VMware changing the cloud strategy right now? I know we get conversations and questions all the time for our consultation. What are your thoughts?
So a lot of the customers that are still heavily leveraging Broadcom, they're in a precarious position where some of them have started to migrate some workloads to the public cloud. Some of them already had a large public cloud presence, but they're shifting some of their private cloud over. A lot of them, because to them their workloads make sense to keep in the data center, they still have the IT hero on staff that can support their data center appropriately. So they're looking at alternate hypervisors as one of those alternatives as well. I mean, I've heard everything from, do we go to one of the public cloud supported VMware services, and those are dwindling and getting less available, it seems like, every month, all the way to, do we just move everything to Broadcom and do a lift and shift just to get away from the price pressure? But that might be a very, very short-term Band-Aid, but I don't think it's a good, effective long-term solution just to shift everything over.
And it certainly flips the economics upside down, right? I mean, for the longest time, it was, well, if we move it to the public cloud, it's stable on-prem, it costs us less. Why not keep it there? There's no real reason, right? There's a whole subset of workloads. As I was, again, rationalizing this with customers, they were like, just cost-wise, it doesn't make sense for us to move. Some of the organizations that are getting their renewal bills from Broadcom, it's pretty level at this point. Will, any thoughts on that from what you're hearing?
About Broadcom?
Yep.
Not much that I can repeat on a public webinar, but I digress. To sum up the conversations I've had about it and some of the writing I've done about it, it's a new front in the FinOps war. The cost had escalated. The VMware team, the customers were used to having their engineers, their customer success. A lot of them were laid off. It wasn't the same company that they had dealt with prior. Broadcom brought in a totally new culture and attitude, and that rubbed a number of people I've spoken with the wrong way.
Whit, I don't know if you had any thoughts.
Yeah, that whole Broadcom piece really upended the apple cart for a lot of companies in terms of they were running most of their workloads on VMs and had deployed them up to the cloud. And all of a sudden their cheap Broadcom VMware pieces were now very expensive Broadcom, and they were looking at how do they manage that. So part of that became, I can't bring my workloads back because I can't run them locally. Well, I can for a while, but I'm going to end up with licensing nightmares. So now brought up other vendors. IBM's OpenShift has been kind of a big migration piece, and they're starting to pick up some of the space in this market as well. So other companies are looking at, how do we adapt? How do we change our workloads? How do we manage things? Do we run everything on VMware? Do we try to stick it up and pull it out of that and run it up in Kubernetes? Can't always do that if you're running, VMs up there. So there's a lot of that workload in terms of, where do I run it and where do I put it? Do I bring it back and put it on a server locally? Do I keep it up in the cloud? And I think that's a company by company decision, because they're looking at a couple of things. They're looking at regulatory and compliance, and they're also looking at finances in terms of, what's this going to cost me, and can I do this gracefully? And what's the migration effort going to be? So there are a lot of factors to take into consideration in terms of those cloud management pieces, in terms of, where do I now put those workloads that got completely disrupted by Broadcom? And what do I do with the things that were running my company?
I always save the best for last. We have a running thing in our marketing team that we're not going to have AI and ML on every slide, but it is probably worth bringing up AI a few times here. How does the kind of race towards AI dominance across the public cloud providers, as well as in most organizations, the race to get AI solutions out there, how is that changing the dynamic of where people are investing in the clouds? And Will, maybe I'll start with you, just maybe a more pointed question. Are you seeing a lot of neo cloud adoption right now, or is it more conversation?
Conversations. Well, first, let me take a step back. I just finished up a project that spoke to that. It's easier to get money now for AI than it is for new hardware for a lot of people. AI is really pushing some enterprises more towards the cloud, but it's also, I think, that hook that hybrid cloud maybe hasn't gotten. I think this is where hybrid cloud, when properly managed, is going to come into wider acceptance. I mean, Whit and Mike might disagree with me, but from my seat as a writer, I've remained bullish on hybrid cloud, but I've spoken to a lot of people like, oh, the management issues, all the blah 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 blah. But I see that AI is going to lead to more hybrid cloud maturity in the enterprise. As far as for the AI market itself, I see that one or two of the CSPs are going to be amongst the only left standing in the AI market once the music stops. So they're going to be here for the long haul, whether customers like it or not. I suspect the culling of the AI herd through 2026 into 2027 at the startup level, and some of the larger vendors as well who maybe weren't as serious about it, and it was more doing AI just for the sake of AI and marketing.
I'll remind myself to send you this recording in a year, and we can compare how the chips fell.
Just way too noisy of a market for me.
Yeah, I agree, Will. It's a noisy market, and I'm going to predict that OpenAI is going to be one of the first ones to fall. They're burning cash at a ridiculous rate with very little to show for it.
Yeah.
And, we've all seen this is the middle of November of 2025. So there's a timestamp for you, Will, in case we need to go back to this next year. Google just released Gemini 3, and it was out of nowhere. Google bobbled their initial Palm releases so badly. It was so poor. And I talked to the guys at DeepMind and really told them they had a Veritas problem because of that. But what we've seen is all the companies adding AI to everything. And when I say AI, I'm talking about TensorFlow and PyTorch to now, kind of some of the large language models. Companies like SAP have added, an LLM to their interface, but they're using their own private, smaller in-house trained models. I think we're going to see some of the large foundational models like Gemini and OpenAI and Grok and Anthropic. Those are going to have their own place, and I think we're going to see more vendors adding their own smaller custom models that do certain things because they're trained, they're tuned, and they help out. So companies like CloudBolt can add AI, and it is huge because it helps with that signal versus noise. That's really where I see a key differentiator in small, well-tuned, well-trained models versus the foundational models that are super broad and aren't necessarily experts at either your data, your process, or your business. And other businesses like healthcare are having huge problems with this because a lot of the foundational models, especially OpenAI, leak data and leak it badly. So we're going to be kind of seeing the different parts of AI. I don't think that they're going to be going away anytime soon. In fact, I think we're going to be doubling down. But I also think that I agree with Will, we're going to be seeing a little bit of the bubble popping, but I don't think it's going to completely go away. Kind of like what we saw the internet bubble popping, 20, 30 years ago. We're going to see something similar, but not as drastic. And some of those fringe companies are going to go by the wayside. And I think we're also going to be seeing more open source models, kind of like what we're seeing out of China, where they're going to be taking the weights and biases from those models so that you can tune them and train them and do more things with them, and you can tune them to your business. So I think it's exciting times for AI. And I think we're going to be seeing a lot more of it, especially for, good, well thought through use cases, not just what we're seeing now. It's like, let's add chatbots to
bolting it on to everything.
Yeah, everything. And whether it needs it or not, you get a chatbot. So I think we're going to see that go away pretty quickly.
All right. Well, I think it's a good place to leave it, just because we are at time. So I want to thank everybody for joining. We do have a control sheet, a CMP control sheet, kind of a quick reference for what control first really means, the capabilities that matter, and then some questions to ask your vendors as you're out there looking. We'll send this to everybody, but if you want to grab that link, you can do so now. And then we would just invite everybody to add Whit, Mike, Will, myself on LinkedIn. Feel free to follow. There's a lot of good content that comes out of the pages of these folks. I think we've got it linked here in the chat itself. And then just, I guess, finally, a thank you to everybody who attended, and a huge thank you, Whit, Mike, Will, thank you so much for joining. This was a great conversation. I knew it was going to be a great conversation. I hope we can have another one with this group again sometime soon.